Dr. Carson, you have recently said that the doctrine of inerrancy should not be used as a scalpel. Could you give us a brief definition of inerrancy and explain why you say it shouldn't be used as a scalpel? It's not that kind of tool.
Well, inerrancy, first of all, the word simply means without error. But like every word in serious theological discussion, it needs some definition. But that's true even for a word like God or faith. In serious discussion, you have to say what you mean by God. What I say by the word God is not what the average Buddhist means by God. And so likewise in inerrancy, there is serious discussion, and there are serious books and articles that talk about the term. It's really one way of saying that the Bible speaks the truth on whatever it says in every domain reliably. You can have the doctrine of inerrancy without even using the word inerrant. In the past, it was more common to use infallibility than inerrancy. And in some contexts, I'm entirely happy with that. But infallibility eventually was associated in certain circles with biblical faithfulness in matters of faith only, but not in matters of history or other factual content. And thus it became a fudge word. It became a word for ducking what had historically been meant by the term. You can go back to the 4th century and correspondence between Jerome and Augustine, for example, where you find unambiguously exactly what we mean by the term inerrancy, even though the terminology is a wee bit different. It has been the standard view of the whole church until about 200 or 250 years ago. And I think that it does need to be maintained today. I don't remember exactly what form of words I used regarding the scalpel, but let me tell you what I meant in any case. There are some people who use the term inerrancy as a test for eliminating some people from the evangelical camp, where the issue really isn't the truthfulness or reliability of Scripture, but the interpretation of Scripture. So in other words, it's possible for someone to hold as firmly and as thoughtfully as you or I to the doctrine of inerrancy, but have a rather peculiar definition of some particular miracle or interpretation of some particular miracle, and think that it's not really a miracle at all. There's something else going on there. It should be explained away as a parable or whatever. And in that case, I would want to question their hermeneutics, but not necessarily their doctrine of inerrancy. If you use the doctrine of inerrancy as the tool which sorts out everything, then it's a scalpel that's cutting out the bad stuff all the time. Now, I want the doctrine in place, but I don't think that it's the only tool in the evangelical arsenal to sort out what's good or bad or what's true or false. In some cases, people have a high view of Scripture and yet make a mess of it because of faulty principles of interpretation or misunderstanding of the Greek text or bias from the culture or whatever it is. So it's not a well-designed tool for handling every error that comes along. It deals with one issue. Namely, is Scripture, whenever it speaks, telling the truth? Now, even there you want to say Scripture does more than simply tell truth. It also performs certain things. It demands or it convicts or whatever. But whenever it is making any sort of propositional claim, then you want to say in whatever it speaks only truth. It does so without error. That allows for different degrees of exactitude. For example, it allows for idiom and all the rest, but I still don't want to apply that test to one that really turns finally on hermeneutics rather than on truth-telling. That's all that I meant by it.
Do you think the doctrine of inerrancy is a cultural or contextual concern? And so certain places in the world where there were certain questions asked, that the doctrine of inerrancy emerged and it's really helpful there, but maybe there are certain places in the world where the church hasn't faced the same questions and the doctrine has not been hammered out. Is that something we should run over to the other side of the world and tell them about, or as long as they're affirming the authority of Scripture and living underneath the authority of Scripture, are you okay with that?
Well, it depends what you mean. And nowadays, not least in the day of worldwide publication and the internet, people just about everywhere can find out what's going on in debates just about anywhere. And so this takes us in another domain, but I was in a Chinese city a few years ago that shall remain unnamed I think it was to expound the Johannine epistles or something like that. But they asked me if I would give a 2-hour additional seminar on how to handle postmodernism in this particular Chinese context. Well, all of my this is 10 or 15 years ago. It was after my book, The Gagging of God, had come out. All my reading and thinking about postmodernism has been out of the Western heritage of thought and foundationalism and anti-foundationalism and all that kind of thing, you know. So I'm busy there scratching my head saying exactly what's going on in a Chinese context where the intellectual history is so very different. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of their theologians and students and so on had been both blessed by and infected by a lot of things that we produce in the Western world, and so the issues had to be brought up and made clear and thought through and sorted out in that context as well. It turned out to be a very interesting 2-hour not only lecture but discussion and give and take and so on. And I would argue that if you are in some context in a remote region of the world where these things are not much discussed yet and you have a low level of education and people are not really much on the internet and so on, but they love their Bibles and they really believe God has spoken and they haven't begun to use words like inerrancy or infallibility, it's not the first matter on the agenda you need to get across. Yet at the same time, you do need to start preparing them for the fact that their better students are going to go away to high school and then college and then do advanced degrees in the West. And some of them are going to come back and start introducing different structures of theology because they only went to liberal universities. They've never seen things through from a confessional frame of reference. And suddenly those things are filtering back into the church that is singularly unprepared for them. And then you realize that part of good pastoral ministry is care in advance for what is certainly coming down the pike. And nowadays ideas move around the world so fast that you, for good and ill, that you really do need to start thinking about preventative medicine as well as what is most urgently needed. And so I could point to you many corners in the world where Western skepticism and Western subjectivism and Western classic liberalism have begun to affect local churches which were brought up with a far more robust supernaturalism and biblical grasp of Scripture. But these things are being presented as a proper way of understanding the Bible. And inerrancy is only for right-wing bigots and the odd ignoramus that comes through under missionary garb or whatever. And somewhere along the line, that means that local leaders have to become exposed to the history of doctrine, the history of interpretation, the history of the doctrine of Scripture, the history of bibliology, as it's called. And that is just part of good pastoral care, it seems to me.